Excellent. We are live here at World Series News, and thank you. Welcome back, everyone, for this brand new report this Monday morning in Australia, Sunday evening in the United States. And it was a massive weekend with the multiple meetings taking place since Friday of the C5, the Arab League, and the G7. And a whole bunch of different announcements have been made, and world leaders seem to be flying all around the world to other countries upon their return, except for Joe Biden, who's racing back to the United States to deal with the debt ceiling crisis. And things aren't going very well over there, with Biden now talking about the 14th Amendment. Simon will be with me shortly to explain a bit more about that. But there is a lot to talk about in this show. We'll keep it as fast as possible to give you all the information that you can. And please share and continue to share like you have been, and comment like you have been, etc., because it makes a big difference to feeding this algorithm. And just as an aside, friends of mine are telling me that on YouTube, where they have subscribed, they're not getting any notifications of the World Series News Jason Q Citizen posts, and that's why the viewership, if you're on there, is extremely low. So that is part of this whole shadow banning. But we're working really well here on Facebook and building up that huge following again that we had in the past. So I'm pretty happy about that. But I just want to bring up something now from Tulsi Gabbard, a quote that she's put out from the weekend before I bring Simon in, just to give you an idea of where we are. Now, Tulsi Gabbard is a former presidential candidate, and Simon and I both think that she'd make a perfect running mate for Bobby Kennedy. And in fact, that should be announced sooner rather than later. Bobby Kennedy has actually spoken more publicly. They're tweeting with each other, which is really interesting. But what a formidable ticket that would be. But check this quote out here. The warmongers are trying to drag us into World War III, which can only end in one way: nuclear annihilation and the suffering and death of all of our loved ones. Zelensky, Biden, NATO, congressional and media neocons are insane. And we are insane if we passively allow them to lead us into this Holocaust like sheep to the slaughter. We find hope in the fact that the vast majority of Americans are sane, but sanity is not enough. We also need courage, the courage to stand up to powerful warmongers and in unison declare, no, we will not allow you to destroy our families, communities, environment, country, and world. That's a pretty significant quote there. Let's bring Simon in for the very latest. Simon, welcome to the show.
Yeah, hi there, Jason. I have to say I'm quite impressed by that statement there by Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, she's taking on a lot of vested interests before she's even on the VP ticket. So I think she would be excellent in debates. She's got congressional and military experience. I'm not sure she's either a major or a lieutenant colonel in the Hawaii National Guard or the Army Reserve, something like that. I'll have to check out that. Yes, but I've seen her in a uniform.
Yeah.
She is lieutenant colonel, is she?
I think so. I'll have to check that as well. But that just rings a bell when you said that.
Yeah. So, I mean, she's obviously, that means you've got quite a significant amount of command experience as well in that regard. And she does speak very well. It was unfortunate, though, because when she last ran as a Democrat candidate in the presidential's primaries, she got knocked out pretty early. She never really polled very highly. So it might be a struggle for her again, but you could say the same thing for Kamala Harris. Like, she only polled, I think the most she ever polled was like 2% or something. So we'll have to...
And she never won a primary, exactly. So
yeah, so it looks, there's a lot of indications that Trump is very keen on Carrie Lake, but she's literally never won any public office. Now, her current legal fight is finally swinging in her favor, having gone all the way to the Arizona Supreme Court and then having had it kicked all the way back down to the lower courts, but with the specific instructions to do X, Y, and Z, which is what she needed, which is largely to do with the signature verification on a lot of the mail-in ballots. I mean, yes. Some of them literally were like signed with an X,
yes,
and clearly fraudulent. And in theory, they were being verified, each one in less than 2 seconds. So they had a whole string of experts saying that, even a computer is barely unable to do that. And it was supposed to be verified by 2 humans. And there's no way 2 humans can look at 2 documents in 2 seconds.
That's right. And one of the persons responsible in that position was no longer there either, and there was
Yeah,
no recollection. So
yeah,
again, all
there
these
was,
chains of evidence are broken.
yeah. So, where do you want to go next? We're going to cover all this kind of international stuff.
Yeah. Look, I think it's important, given the pattern that we're normally covering, let's go to, even though it's not necessarily the biggest story there, let's go to the Greek election, because it is significant, because people are looking for change or not change, and who's winning and who's losing. But it turns out that the New Democracy is set for victory. This is the incumbent, the Conservative Party. Looks like it will continue in a second term, but still be a minority government.
Yeah, so they're going to have to form a coalition. I've got to say, it's a little surprising, because the Greek economy is crap. Food inflation's been sky high. It wasn't at all popular then giving a lot of weapons to Ukraine, because the Greek Orthodox really associated a lot with the Russian Orthodox, and Putin had been to visit Greece many times. He was very keen on going to the monastery at Mount Athos. I think he'd been there three times now. And so it's still a minority government. That's not particularly surprising, given how many political parties there are in Greece. But what that certainly shows is going to be no change in policy with regards to NATO or the war or the EU. So it's kind of more of the same there. Obviously, we've got news in Turkey, if you want to discuss that now.
Sure.
So the guy who came third in the primary elections, Mr. Ogan, he polled just around 6%. And he had been kind of auditioning with both the main candidates as to who he would publicly throw his support to. It was pretty distasteful that he had managed to persuade the opposition candidate to pledge that he would throw out all of the Syrian refugees from Turkey, which horrified a lot of that guy's socialist and youth supporters, who really felt very sympathetic for those people, particularly after all the earthquakes and stuff, and obviously the civil war that had taken place in Syria. And so he's damaged himself trying to get those 6% swung over to him, albeit that you get to vote a second time. This guy can't redirect his votes, kind of like the preferential system in Australia, where people can designate where their votes go. So everyone's going to have to vote again this coming Sunday. Overseas voting has already started in many other countries yesterday. And it now looks extremely likely that the current President Erdogan will get re-elected. The six-party coalition that was backing the opposition candidate are at each other's throats with recriminations as to who was responsible for them not winning in the first round. But this is basically bad news for NATO, bad news for the EU, and really good news for Putin. Really good news for Putin.
Okay, that is interesting, isn't it?
Erdogan has said unequivocally in the last couple of days that he will not be applying any sanctions on Russia, and that he feels that have a great need to cooperate in terms of gas and oil and food and tourism. It would be interesting to see if we had this situation where Russian debit cards were acceptable for a few months in Turkey for the Russian tourists to use. Basically, the two places the Russian tourists are going at the moment are Thailand and Turkey. And the Americans kicked a real stink with the Turkish central bank. So all the smaller banks stopped accepting the debit cards. But that would be a big sign of what lays before us if the Turkish banks all start accepting the Russian debit cards as they go into the summer school holidays period. Because obviously that's a real, this next 3 months, June, July, August, is huge for all the hotels and restaurants and all that kind of stuff. So they really, really want that business. So that'll be that's something that I'll, a bit remote, but will really indicate where the inclinations lie. Some people have even been speculating that Erdogan might withdraw from NATO, but I don't think Putin would necessarily encourage that. I think he serves Russian and Chinese interests more by being inside NATO, being a spoiler like Viktor Orban, rather than being outside and just being a clear-cut adversary.
Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Now let's cross Simon to with Ukraine. There's a whole lot we can talk about with Zelensky, but this idea that Bakhmut was not going to be taken, not true. It has.
Yeah, so even Zelensky himself has confirmed that Bakhmut has fallen. He said it only remained in his heart. And obviously the Russians are happy about that. The transfer date from the Wagner private military company that was surprisingly announced as May 25th has been changed officially to June 1st. Zelensky did turn up in person in Hiroshima to meet all the people at the G7 conference, and Biden rewarded him by gifting Ukraine another $375 million, which is relatively small in comparison to some of the other contributions, but you have to bear in mind that he does it every week. So it's half $1 billion a week.
Hang on a second. So Biden, with no money, racing back to the United States for the debt ceiling because they've run out of money, has still managed to wrap up another $375 million to give to Zelensky. Is that right?
Yeah, and bear in mind that he got billions every single country that he went to in Europe when he did his grand tour all of last week. When he went to the Nordics, and then he went to Poland, and he went to France, and he went to Germany, and he went to the UK. So everywhere he went, they were either giving him cash or weapons.
You do have to wonder at this stage how much money you can possibly give to Zelensky. What's he spending the money on at this stage? If he's losing soldiers and losing weapons, does he just go down to the local Walmart?
Well, the interesting thing that's gone public is there was a British recruitment company who were advertising amongst illegal immigrants, the boat people who have been turning up in the UK, right? For anyone with prior military experience to be flown immediately to Ukraine and receive £20,000 and a choice of UK or EU citizenship for fighting in one campaign with the Ukrainians. And I looked, and I can't figure out, let's say 1,000 people go out of the 50,000 currently in hotels and army camps and stuff, for all these people who have been coming over, 1,000 a week on the boats, right? Let's say 1,000 of them went, right? I can't see what provision there is in UK law for giving British citizenship to an illegal immigrant in return for them fighting for the Ukrainians in Ukraine for 1 or 2 months, for which they're going to be paid £20,000 cash as well. I just can't see, it's kind of discretionary for the king or the prime minister to give somebody who's won the Nobel Prize, honorary citizenship or something like that, but not 1,000 illegal immigrants.
Yes.
And it makes you wonder how much this recruitment is being done in the millions of illegal immigrants in France and Germany as well. The Russians are suddenly going to find themselves fighting a foreign legion of illegal immigrants who don't even speak a common language. That's going to make command and control pretty interesting. All right. But, frankly, it's quite a lot of money for a month or two. Now, it didn't specify what, if any, death benefit there was. So if there was 50% casualty or 50% fatality rate, then I guess they weren't going to pay them at all. It was kind of like a lottery in that regard. But it just goes to show how they must be really scraping the barrel if they've given up on snatching 15 and 16-year-olds out of their mother's arms, and instead they're taking any person with no background check who claims to have prior military experience and is willing to get on a plane.
Yeah. Unbelievable. Simon, we're 15 minutes in. I just want to, whilst our audience is coming in and out, and thanks everyone for sharing again, the velocity in which people are watching and sharing has been brilliant, and the message is getting out there. It's hard work. Simon, can you just share for the audience just some of the other shows that you've been on just in the last week? It's truly extraordinary, the amount of reach that you're now getting.
Well, just in the last Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So I've been on InfoWars on Friday. I was on TNT Radio on Friday. I was on George Galloway today. That was my 9th appearance on the Galloway show. And you and I, have we done Friday, Saturday, Sunday? We have, haven't we?
Yeah, it's been a big weekend, yeah.
We don't normally do that, but just because of all these overlapping international conferences, it's normally, for me, that is, and Saturday and Monday mornings for you in Australia. But no, so I've done 6 shows in 2.5 days.
Yeah, wow. So clearly there's a huge demand for understanding of what's going on, and it is the detail here that we're happily being able to supply and interpret. Now, what I want to do is
you seem to have frozen.
Oh, I might have lost you there in the internet. So what I'm going to do while Simon's just getting sorted, because I've still got internet coming through here, okay. We're still live. Let me just cross to the Quad meeting that happened on the weekend. I'm just going to put up a picture and just read a quote there whilst hopefully Simon comes back in. But
yeah, I'm here.
Got you there. I'm just going to read a quote, Simon, from the Quad. And because this is very important from what happened with the C5 and the G7 meeting over the weekend as well. But this is a quote. We seek a region where no country dominates and no country is dominated, one where all countries are free from coercion and can exercise their agency to determine their futures. Our 4 countries are united by this shared vision. And this is where it's been taken here, this particular quote from the Prime Minister of Australia's office, and this is where we're talking about what happened with the Quad meeting. But Simon, what I find objectionable to this is how they're talking about the no coercion, and yet what happened with the G7, there was China getting their nose out of joint when it was talked about that there would be, they're accusing China of using economic coercion. But they're not really offering a deal for anyone. China's the one throwing money and infrastructure around with great new deals that benefit people. Why do they go in and pretend to play the high ground in all of this at the Quad and deliver
well,
nothing?
There's 2 things they want to maintain: this freedom of navigation. And it's ironic, and it has come up recently, that American Senate has not ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So they're trying to hold other countries to that standard, but it's just like the International Criminal Court. Like, I think, who was it, Bill Clinton or somebody signed that, and that's also never been ratified by the Senate. So, it's America claiming that there's a international set of rules, but they don't apply to them.
Yes, that's right. That's the point,
I mean, literally, they don't apply to them, right? Yeah. And if they did apply to them, then they'd claim some kind of like exemption or get out clause. So that's obviously a big issue. And then the thing about the free agency is because lots of their organizations have got open door policies. So like anybody in theory can join NATO, and anybody in theory can join the IPEF. And now that they're trying to make kind of like NATO Asia, what they want to be able to do is sign all of these tiny Pacific Island countries essentially into what would now be like NATO South Pacific. But India's got their own specific agenda for that. Japan and South Korea don't really, but definitely America does. And obviously Australia and New Zealand are still in a kind of like a protectorate situation for like what technically like the Solomon Islands and Niue and Tonga and Rarotonga and places like that. So, and then the French have still got New Caledonia and French Polynesia. So, they've got interest to maintain there. Plus, they've still got their prefecture in Reunion. So, what we're now going to see is the British are going to deploy a nuclear submarine, an Astute-class submarine. Assuming that it can get out of the English Channel, they're going to send their one functioning aircraft carrier into the Northern Pacific / South China Sea. It will be hilarious if it breaks down again and they have to like tow it to the Philippines or tow it to Singapore or tow it to Japan or something, because it has been in the shipyard for months and months and months. Now they're stripping spare parts to fly out to the first one. So the whole thing's like a complete laughing stock, right? I mean, if they send everything to Asia, as far as the British Navy is concerned, and the Argentinians suddenly pile into the Falkland Islands, they're literally going to be sending like rubber dinghies and kind of like trying to ransom American, World War II destroyers out of their reserve fleet or something, because they've got nothing left to send. I mean, it's just, it's looking so easy for the Argentinians. If they didn't have like 108% inflation, I'm sure they'd be extremely tempted to have a crack at the Malvinas again. But at the moment, their economy is in such a bad way, they just can't justify the expenditure. Wow. But in terms of, forming an alliance against China, it's real clear that that's obviously what the Quad is. That's what this new Tripart agreement between Japan, South Korea, and America is. And they're actually talking about physically connecting all of their radar and early warning systems, so that they have much better situational awareness for the whole of the kind of like Sea of Japan, Korean Peninsula, and the Northern Pacific. So it just remains to be seen whether or not the Philippines formally join that. There's a lot of political pushback in the Philippines over that. People are really unhappy about those 4 additional US military bases that have been granted to the Americans, because people rightly feel that's made them a significant target for the Chinese. But, Norway's just done the same thing, and Greece has just done the same thing in Europe. So, the Americans are just, increasing the number of bases that they've got all over the world, despite the fact that they're about to go bust on the 1st of June, because there's a lot of problems on that debt deal. Whatever deal the Republicans thought they had on Friday, when McCarthy was saying that he thought that the whole issue would be dealt with by this weekend and they could get everything signed and sealed by Friday coming up, which was the Friday before the long holiday weekend for Memorial Day. And now he's claiming that the Biden administration is backtracking on everything that they've agreed on. And so there's really quite a breakdown in both relations and in the specifics of the deal. And we'll just have to see if the Republicans will hold their party together. I suspect that the Democrats will put an emergency motion before the House of Representatives, and they'll manage to peel away at least 10 Republicans. And actually, the Democrats will get it through, and they'll claim an enormous victory, having like saved pension payments and saved the military from all their ships sinking and the planes dropping out the sky because they couldn't afford to refuel them or something, something ludicrous kind of story. But that will be a disaster for the Republicans if that is how it ends up. Because it is astonishing how many times the Democrats managed to peel away just a few Republicans with one promise or the other. And they just don't have anything like the party unity that the Democrats do. Very, very rarely do Democrats cross the aisle, and yet it's extremely common. You get a few rhino and real social democrat type Republicans in name only, and McCarthy only needs to lose it's like 5 or 6 people, and he can be voted down. So
yeah,
that is definitely the hot issue domestically in America for this coming week.
Now let's say they cannot reach agreement and the US hits a stage where it actually is going to default. Does that mean that there is no money to pay absolutely
No, it doesn't
anybody?
mean it doesn't. See, that's a misunderstanding. It doesn't mean that there's. Let's say the national debt at the moment, hypothetically, is $32 trillion, right? And then fall due in the month of June. Just throwing out random numbers, okay? Replacement bonds to pay the principal on those. They've got enough money coming in as operating income to pay the interest. What they can't do is say, okay, we want to give Zelensky birthday, and therefore we're going to try and sell another $500 billion worth of bonds to the Japanese and the Saudi Arabians, and therefore increase the national debt. So they can maintain the national debt at its current level. And on the monthly income, then they've probably got, they do have enough that they can maintain the key things like pensions, disability payments, food stamps, military expenditure, and salaries for most of the federal government. Though in the past, where the budget simply hasn't been met, they've just sent the entire federal government home. And then once it's been approved, they've given everyone a month of back pay, even though they didn't actually do any work. So they literally got like vacation time, paid vacation time.
Yes.
And I suspect that something very similar to that would happen here. Now, there may be some just what they call discretionary projects that wouldn't continue to be funded. And it's possible that, if they want to start a new nuclear submarine or a new aircraft carrier, that might get delayed for a month or two. But in terms of, the soldiers and the sailors being paid, that's not going to stop, because all of those people are considered essential personnel, just like under the COVID rules. Right? So it's not quite as apocalyptic as some people are thinking, but it would be good in the sense that it would force immediate budget cuts, such that they wouldn't be able to continue running this kind of over $1 trillion a year of deficit. I mean, when you had Trump in and you had the Republicans controlling the Senate and the House of Representatives, they literally had 2 years in which to pass some kind of balanced budget resolution, everything short of, a nuclear war or something. And they just didn't. They spent like drunken sailors, much like they did during the Reagan era when they were trying to outspend the Soviets in the nuclear and space arms race. And so, frankly, it doesn't seem to matter which political party are in power. They both spend without any self-control whatsoever.
Yes, exactly right. Now, Simon, the weekend from the Xi'an meeting with the C5 was so impressive. It was probably the highlight of the weekend from the 3 big meetings. The speech delivered on Friday at the Central Asia Summit, as you can see there in the tweet, resulted in a massive agreement between the 5 Central Asian countries, featuring Kazakhstan and the other 4 stand countries, to simplify for the for the simplicity of language here, because they're impossible to say when you're trying to speak with your mouth full of marbles. And there they are on the screen: Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan and Tajikistan put this massive deal together where they effectively are adopting Chinese principles and business opportunities with energy, with education, with health, etc. Such a massive deal, and it links together Russia to China with these massive countries in the middle, and that landmass is over 30 million square kilometres, which makes it almost 25% of the total planet's landmass. But post the G7, who imposed more sanctions on Russia, you've got Macron going to Mongolia, sitting above China. What is that all about? And is that just an exercise or is it just false hope for the Western nations of the G7?
I mean, it seems on the face of it completely absurd, but what appears to be happening, and literally the French media have confirmed this, so it's not really my speculation, is that on behalf of the Americans, Macron is trying to peel away Mongolia, which is landlocked in between Russia and China, to be like a consolation prize, the Americans having lost the C5. But 86% of Mongolia's exports go to China. China can literally just say, we're not buying one more single yak from you, no more yak milk, no more coal. And the entire Mongolian economy would go into meltdown in a week. So the idea that somehow they're going to become like a bastion of American democracy in between China and Russia is just, I mean, you know, I'm tired of laughing at some of these stupid American schemes at this point, right? So that's like a complete non-starter. But it's interesting that Modi went without Biden to Papua New Guinea.
Yes.
So he's still pushing the Quad agenda. Blinken is going to follow him. So they're trying to tie up deals with Palau, Federation of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands to try and block Chinese interests in the South Pacific. It looks like at least two of those deals are going to go ahead, though they're unhappy that Biden's not showing up. This goes to show where his priorities are, obviously. And then didn't you find that Schultz is going to South Korea as well, isn't he?
Yeah, that's right. So we've got
So
this is the result of the G7. So France is sent to Mongolia, Germany's going to South Korea, and Modi's headed to Papua New Guinea. And so we've worked out now with Schultz. Where are we here? I'm just looking for the quote. Here it is here. Schultz has praised Seoul for providing humanitarian aid to Ukraine and participating in sanctions against Russia. He also said in a written interview with South Korea's Yonhap news agency that it was up to each nation to determine how they would help Ukraine. And in the same interview, Schultz also condemned North Korea's weapons tests, but said it was important to leave a window open for dialogue.
Yeah, but you see, that was a bit misleading there because he was talking about humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and that's how it started off. But then what actually happened was South Korea, so Ukraine was flat out of ammo, right, for their artillery. They had a real problem. They had 105 millimeter ammo that the British were giving them, but that doesn't have a very long range. So they wanted 155 ammo. And in the end, the Americans persuaded that South Koreans didn't want to give it to the Ukrainians and they didn't want to sell it to the Ukrainians. So what they did is they lent 500,000 big artillery shells to the Americans, who promised to give it back to them at some point, and the Americans immediately flew it to the Ukraine. So technically, the South Koreans didn't give it to the Ukrainians. They lent it to the Americans, who completely unbeknown to the South Koreans, then gave it to the Ukrainians, but it's now the Americans that have the responsibility to give it back to the South Koreans. So it's basically how America got around its neutrality in 1940 to help Britain with the Lend-Lease Act. Do you remember that from World War II?
No, let's explain that again.
Lend-Lease Act. So they said that they weren't selling weapons to Britain and they weren't giving weapons to Britain. They were lending them weapons.
Okay. Oh, that makes all the difference. It's interesting, isn't it, how you said before that that's one rule for me and one rule for thee, that we'll make all the rules up for everyone else, but we'll exclude ourselves in this particular situation. And at the same time, I'm just going to put that quote back up from the Quad, which from Albanese: we seek a region where no country dominates and no country is dominated, one where all countries are free from coercion and can exercise their agency to determine their futures. Our four countries are united by this shared vision. It sounds like everything that's going on is the exact opposite of that.
But it is interesting, though, isn't it, that the G20 head of government meeting is going to be held in Indian-occupied Kashmir, yes, which India annexed, right? So that's basically just like the Russians annexing the Donbass. It's exactly the same. And bear in mind that if you go back to the original history, then like North and South Vietnam and like North and South Korea, North and South Kashmir was supposed to have had UN-sponsored election to decide its fate, and they've never, ever had that referendum.
There you go. So we're living in that. There's another example. Simon, I want to cross to Pakistan. I think it's really important that we get an update there with what's happening with Imran Khan. Now, he has given an interview to Al Jazeera, but it was only a short interview. The main grab from that was that he says that the government and the army want to crush the PTI, which is his political party. And just putting up on the screen now, another tweet that you shared on your Twitter file. And for those people that want to follow Simon from Flori, FLORI2 is how you'll find Simon for all of the details, speeches, etc. But on the screen, the viewers can see at least 18 different PTI members that have been arrested and continue.
Yeah,
to
so
be held.
that's gone from 10 to 18. When we last discussed Pakistan, which was Friday, the head count on the arrested party members was 7,500. That's now over 10,000. Supposedly, Imran Khan has been offered safe passage to leave the country if he wants to, so that he can avoid prosecution.
Wow.
And he's declined to do that. He has to present himself before the National Accountability Bureau on Tuesday, and he's told CNN that he also did an interview with that was just terrible by Fareed Zakaria, that he thinks there's an 80% chance that he'll be arrested on Tuesday. So that's how things stand. A lot more political party members have been resigning. So that's been, I'm sure, quite emotionally difficult for him. He said that he'll fill all those places with members from the youth ranks. So that's keeping all the youth on board. There is still clearly a good amount of popular support for him, but he's now speculating, like I did, that the government will declare a state of emergency and avoid holding the elections, which are due in October.
Right.
So that's how things stand in Pakistan. There's also a claim that the army chief of staff, when he visited the Chinese, did a deal with them to double the length of their mining concessions inside Pakistan. So it looks, if that turns out to be true, that my suspicions about why that senior general went to China may indeed turn out to be true, but that's unverified as of now. There have been lots more reports about dissent within the army, and also the relevant general going to every single major army base, just screaming at the staff officers, trying to make sure that they stay on side. And there's also reports that several officers are actually having their family members held hostage. So obviously, where you have a real strong leader, if they're suddenly arrested, then you run the risk of their entire division or corps mutinying. So the government and this general haven't arrested other generals, what they've done is they've nabbed their wives and children, and they're effectively holding them hostage so that the generals keep their troops in line with government policies. So it is really becoming like a mafia state.
Yeah, absolutely. The criminals have taken over in Pakistan, if you will, a country that's always had a notorious bent for corruption. And the man that's getting in there to try and clean it out is the one they accuse of all the crimes. I mean, most people watching realise the fallacy behind it, but there are so many that just cannot get their mind around the fact that authority is the truth when it's not in so many cases, and that's the purpose of what we're doing here. Simon, the last thing I want to touch on before we go is just quickly, was there any significant updates out of the Arab League summit that was held at the weekend?
No. I would say the only thing was that Qataris caused a bit of stink by leaving before the event was over, didn't personally saying thank you, didn't go to like the reception afterwards, and they had to put out a statement saying, frankly, that their attendance was only a courtesy, and having like signed the guest book, they felt they could leave whenever they wanted. And I'm sure that would have caused quite a bit of offence in Saudi Arabia. They didn't even hold any bilateral meetings. They literally kind of showed up, listened to a few speeches and left. So that was, frankly, a bit surprising. Thought they could have just sat there for a few hours. There will clearly be more meetings since Saudi Arabia is the head of the organization for this year. The big news that came out and that did get a condemnation issued by Saudi Arabia was Ben Gvir, the Israeli national security minister, stormed into the Al-Aqsa Mosque courtyard with like army and police, did a press conference standing there, said that it was ridiculous that anybody suggested that any Israeli Jew couldn't go into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He said that all of that territory, the actual physical buildings and the courtyard of the mosque, were Israeli territory over which they had total and exclusive control. So in theory, the King of Jordan is the guardian of that location, which has been internationally recognized as being multinational due to its extreme religious significance. And so that will have caused enormous offense across the Muslim world. And I'm sure we'll see more condemnations in the following day. But it was very interesting that the Saudis immediately put out a statement to that effect. And it was ironic because the Times of Israel just 2 days ago had said that the government still hoped that they would be able to re-establish direct flights with Saudi Arabia and make slow progress towards normalization. And that stunt just kicked that in the nuts. There's they are making it just politically impossible, even if Mohammed bin Salman wanted to do it, to do any kind of deal with the Israelis. Literally, I mean, if he came out and said we're joining the Abraham Accords, you'd get a terrorist campaign inside Saudi Arabia overnight, and you might even get a revolution. I mean, public opinion is really, really against any.
Okay.
Not only has that been done, but now some political operatives have leaked a story about Smotrich, the finance minister, and supposedly when the government was formed a few months ago, he announced at a cabinet meeting that it was full steam ahead with something called Israel 2000 or Plan 2000, which was not only to build tens of thousands of new homes in the West Bank, but to annex the whole thing as he has administratively done. He's now the chief of the West Bank, and it's been put under his civilian control as opposed to the military. But he was also proposing, just like the German plan, to move Germans into Poland to take over the agricultural areas. He wants to move 500,000 Israeli citizens onto the West Bank. So that story's leaked out, and it doesn't seem to have got too much coverage at the moment across the Middle East, but I'm sure it will, because the details are quite shocking. And it's completely against every single United Nations resolution and against the US policy. So, if they start implementing that en masse, that's going to cause massive problems.
Oh, absolutely. Now, I just want to bring up a couple of things here from Australia. Jim Chalmers was reported on 9 News today that inflation is not dropping like expected, heaven forbid, and his attitude has been that he's saying that we're going to support those with lower incomes with more financial support. But what he's ignoring in all of this is that it's the velocity of money that causes the inflation, not necessarily pumping the money into the economy, as Jim Rickards has talked about last week. And the situation here that if you keep putting more money into a system and more money is being pushed in and spent, then you're never going to be able to bring that inflation rate down. So Chalmers is at last copping some criticism. And this, Simon, also interestingly, on the day that debate this week will commence in the Australian Parliament over the Voice, and it turns out that support is also dropping for the Voice. So there will be some debate there. But interestingly, just on
well, that's why Albo is desperately flying back. Yes. Because he's worried about being able to cross the Aboriginal airspace.
Yes. And for those that haven't seen it, please check out Pauline Hanson's Please Explain video, where the Prime Minister's been given a new nickname, Simon.
Maybe that's why he wants the submarines, so that he can sneak under all the rental barriers.
See, there you go. This is starting to make a whole lot more sense. You know, something that's really interesting here in Australia, Simon, is that if we're looking at a Voice and supposedly, you know, we're going to adjust our constitution so that we create a whole new area so that people of Indigenous backgrounds literally get two voices. This is the strange part of it. But the one thing that I want to know about this in just a debate, I just want to throw it out there at this point. If you are pro-Voice, are you pro-Republic at that point, or are you pro-monarchy, or are they mutually exclusive ideas? Because I would have thought that if you're going to want to bring Indigenous values forward, and that's fantastic, but are you therefore going to say we don't now want to be held by the monarchy in this point? And I think that these are valid arguments to have, or at least conversations to take place in this discovery. There's no point sitting on our hands and either pretending that nothing exists in all of this and turn up in October and vote yes or no because of a popular idea or how we'll be accepted in the general public. But it should be a point where, as Australians, we can start to think about what it is that we really want for our country in the future going forward. Yes, we have this big climate agenda and we're going to switch everything off to go green and virtue signal to the world, but do we want to be an independent nation that completely close our borders if we wanted to and let nobody in if it got to that? Because in 2030, if there's no more power, what do we do here in Australia when we've mRNA'd our cattle and we don't want to eat the meat anymore and we've become this new total different world? What do we want for it? So the idea that the Voice is finally going to be debated this week, hopefully that will stir up a can of worms and people can actually start talking about what they really want for their country and not be led down the path of just adopting what Anthony Albanese and his Labor Party wants to say, and everyone just joining a bandwagon in all of it. Bit of a rant to sort of get to the end of the show, Simon, but I just thought it would be something to whet the appetite of the Australian audience and saying, yeah, what is this whole Voice deal about? And why is it that we don't really know what's going on and where do we head in our future?
Well, don't forget, if the Aboriginals are really in control and they have free agency that's desirable by the Quad members, right? There's no reason why they couldn't just sell the whole of Australia to the Chinese for $10 trillion. That would give them about $10 million each, be enough for a boat and a mansion in Dubai, and they could all move to Dubai, and then the Chinese could just move in and be your overlords.
Well, it's kind of funny.
No, but that would be like legally, technically possible, right?
Yes. That's the point there. And do we get to a stage somewhere in the future? It might not be next year, it might be in a generation or 100 years, but that's entirely a possibility. And that's something that, again, that these are the conversations that we'd like to have, but just don't ever seem to get off the ground. You can have them here on World Series News. I've put up my email address there if you want to send through a question for a future show. I'll put it up again on the bottom of the screen for you. Just jasonqcitizen@gmail.com. Fire through an email, perhaps a suggestion or a question or an area that you'd like us to cover. We're more than happy to do that. And thanks everyone for sharing and commenting today. I'm really encouraged by the people putting in some really terrific thoughts. I've whacked them there up on the screen. Tim's written, "The voice is nothing but divisive. Australian Constitution covers all people already. Republic only gives the WEF more power over our sovereignty." Well said. It's a terrific comment there. Catherine's written, "Modi despises Beijing Biden. Quad was made with Trump. He'll be back." Tim's also written, "New biolabs," with a laugh out loud. So it's interesting that people are really wanting to chime in here in the debate and have those questions. So I'm really chuffed, everyone. Thank you very much for doing that. Simon, just before you go, what are you looking at this week? I know we've got the Turkish runoff elections, and it does look like Erdogan's going to win power. Are there any other big notable things that we need to look out for?
Yes. The real big thing that we haven't discussed so far that we do need to pay attention to is the World Health Assembly that are meeting all of this week through to the 30th of May. So we'll definitely get into that when we do the Wednesday show, all right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Simon. It's been a terrific show. And thanks, everyone, again, for contributing, for sharing, and for sending comments and likes. And as I said, jasonqcitizen@gmail.com. And just one thing before we go, Simon, I'll just whack up your Twitter handle for those people that want to get the information and the details, the speeches, etc. Simon from Flory 2. And my Twitter account there is JasonQCitizen1. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the support, and we'll continue to bring you more news here on World Series News. Have a wonderful week, and chin up, because there is a new world, and we get to talk about it. And if we're good enough, we get to design it as well. And that's for you at Watch.